February 1945. As the Americans came closer to the Japanese mainland, fighting in the Pacific grew still more bitter. The bombardment crumbled one side of Iwo's key bastion, Mount Suribachi, but it took 5 bloody days for the Marines to fight their way to its summit. When the Marines set out to place a conqueror's flag on Suribachi, they still encountered resistance. But they persevered, and the flag was raised. Unfortunately, it lacked properly heroic proportions. Something would have to be done.
It was too small to be seen by anybody. So the commanding general down there figured we better get a bigger flag. So they went out and got some of the LSTs that were there, and one of the LST commanders said, well, when we stopped at Pearl, we got a big flag, but we've never flown it. My boss came to me and said, would you make sure that you send photographers up, because this is going to be considered the official flag raising. So I said, sure, and I got in touch with Janoust and Bob Campbell. Bill Janoust was a movie man, Bob Campbell was still, and they hooked up with Rosenthal going up the hill.
That was Joe Rosenthal of the Associated Press, a civilian photographer who had taken these pictures of the landing. These are the shots Janoust took on that second climb. A few days later, he would be killed in action. He would not live to see the images he made.
People would always contest whether or not this was the first or whether the other one was the first and everything else. But Bob Campbell didn't like the position that the other 2 cameramen were in. So he got off a little bit over to the side, and he's got a beautiful picture of the first flag coming down and the second one going up at the same time.
It was Rosenthal, however, who got the immortal shot, and a lifetime's controversy, for he shipped all his pictures back unseen and undeveloped.
Okay. Today is February the 15th, 2012, and we're here at the home of Colonel Paul Ortiz in Stafford, is that correct? Virginia. And we're interviewing Lieutenant General Lawrence Snowden, USMC retired. We're going to hear his biography. So, General Snowden, I'm going to turn it over to you with the first question.
Okay.
And I want to do is find out, first of all, where were you born?
I was born in Charlottesville, Virginia.
What year?
1921. April the 14th of 1921.
And where did you go to school?
Well, I attended the local Lane High School in the city, and then I went 1 year to Stetson University down in DeLand, Florida, because my father thought I ought to have a year off on my own and grow up a little, which I think I did. But then, in those days, every good Virginia boy had to finish at the University of Virginia. So I finished at the University of Virginia, though I wasn't there for the graduation ceremony. The Marine had called me, the Marine Corps had called, and on May the 10th, 11th, I was in Quantico, and the University of Virginia very kindly said they'll mail me my certificate of graduation. So,
how about your parents? What was their occupation?
Well, you got to remember now, my father was born in 1887. Born down in Central Virginia in an area called Palmyra, some 23 miles from Charlottesville, and he dropped out of high school and walked to Charlottesville and went to work for a livery stable. He polished the horses and polished the leather and drove a jitney that took tourists to Monticello, to Thomas Jefferson's home.
And how about your mom?
She was a native Virginia girl. From her birth certificate says Charlottesville. She insists she was born over in Greenville. And Greenville is right along the Virginia-West Virginia border. And people born in that area didn't know whether they were West Virginians or Virginians, but they all claimed to be Virginians. And so she did too. And in her early years after she married my father, she was a a seamstress for a lady who made custom clothing for ladies.
Are there any brothers and sisters out there?
No, I was an only child, and that had its disadvantages according to some people, but I always thought it was an advantage. And some of them said, well, who did you talk to? I said, well, I had a little dog named Fritz, and I talked to Fritz. And when I had a problem, Fritz and I would get under my bed, and I would talk through my problem with Fritz, and his brown eyes, and he looked me straight in the eye, and I'd say, and he'd turn his head and listen. And unfortunately, I never taught him to speak English, so he didn't have any answers to my problems, but he was my first real buddy in life, I'll tell you that.
So what were you doing before you entered into the Marine Corps?
Well, I was in the University of Virginia. I was in my senior year. And when the Pearl Harbor thing struck and we got that news at the university, I was singing with the Tin Can Quartet, the barbershop outfit, and we were rehearsing, and it's late in the afternoon, and suddenly there's a big bang on the door, and the student sticks his head in and says, the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor. I was the only guy in the room who knew where Pearl Harbor was. Now, what made me so smart? I had an economics professor at the university who 2 years before Pearl Harbor said, we are going to have war with Japan. It's only a question of where and how is it going to start. And because he said that, and I was coming up for military age, of course, so I thought I'd better check on that. So I looked into it and found out Pearl Harbor and other places in the Pacific. And so I was smart when that day come. But the next day, about 10 of us went down to the Charlottesville post office. There was an old recruiting sergeant there. I mean, he was an old Corps Marine. And he said, your case, you're a senior, you have to wait for the officer recruiter to come. I can't enlist you. But then, like the good recruiter in those days, he handed me a blank sheet of paper. And he said, put your name and your address and phone number down. Blank sheet of paper. And I did that. I handed him back, and he said, you are now committed to the Marine Corps. I thought about it in hindsight. What a rascal he was. Blank sheet of paper, but I signed it, and I'm committed to the Marine Corps. But that's okay. It worked out, and once I was at Quantico and did this thing there, I never looked back.
Did you have any other family members that joined the military at all? Uncles?
Not then, no. No, my father was a sergeant in the Army, in the Medical Corps in World War I. He had a brother who went overseas, and my father always regretted that he didn't get overseas because he was a medic. He was assigned to Fort Sherman in Kentucky, where the Army had a flu epidemic. So he stayed there his whole time and came out as a sergeant in the Army.
So where did you go to boot camp?
I went to Quantico, where there was an officer boot camp, and some refused to believe that what we did was similar to what was going on in Paris and San Diego. But I can tell you it was true. That they worked us, and we had good enlisted NCOs as our drill instructors and platoon sergeants. And they didn't want us getting any free trades on anything. So they worked us pretty hard, but it was good, the way it should have been.
The question is, why the Corps and not some other branch of the service?
That's a long story. Let me tell you that I had a family dentist that I've been going to since grade school. He was 6'4", had a hand on him assigned to the behind end of a hog ham. But how he got that in my mouth, I've never figured out. And anyway, he went all, and he had served in the Marine Corps and served in Nicaragua. So when I was in his chair, he would tell me about Nicaragua, but he always finished by saying, you wouldn't be able to do that. I mean, that's too tough for you. Well, all he did was plant the challenge in my heart. So as soon as Pearl Harbor struck, I was down there, I was going to be a Marine, show him I could do it.
So he was using Tom Sawyer psychology.
Absolutely, and it worked. And when the war was over, at World War II, I came home for a short leave, and I put on my uniform and went to call on him to tell him that I made it. Unfortunately, about 7 months before that, he had died, so I never got a chance to say, I told you I could do it. But he was a fine guy and a true Marine. I guess I can only say that it was when the fighting stopped on that 36th day, it was simply relief that you'd made it. And you stopped to think about your buddies who hadn't made it, and you were very sad. And I've sat with young Marines when they were just crying their hearts out just because they lost a buddy that they've been bunking with him for a year and all this kind of stuff. And they said, you know, how did it happen to him and didn't happen to me? Well, none of us can ever answer that question, but it always gets to be a point in your mind to ask, why me, God? What? Two guys on this side, both of them dead from artillery round, and I'm standing there. How do I explain it? I can't. Nothing. Just to charge it off to God's working in mysterious ways, I suppose.
Well, one more question about Iwo Jima. The flag raisings. Many people seen them. Many people had no clue that even occurred. Where were you, and did you see the flag raising?
Well, I was down on the first airfield with my company, and we saw the first one go up. It was pretty tiny, but we could see that there was a flag up there. And so we felt that that was a sign of progress. Suribachi was loaded with pillboxes and fighting holes, and we were taking a lot of fire from that down on the first airfield area. So it, at that time of real progress, because we'd captured the mountain. Now then they had to work our way down and clean out all that stuff, and meanwhile we're still getting the fire from it. So it didn't mean we'd won, but it suggested we were going to win. And when they put up this, and I read an author some time ago who said, when that whistle went up, every Marine on the island stood up and cheered. Not in my company. We were engaged with an enemy to our front, and any Marine who stood up and cheered that thing got a bullet in his head or his heart or his stomach or somewhere. So nobody in my outfit stood up and cheered, but they were extremely happy to see that up there because.
Thank you.